Dear learners, welcome back to WSE History Uncovered, where learning English is not just about words and grammar, but about stepping into the living stories of our world. Today, we invite you to sit at a table far grander than any you have known, a table where kings once dined under candlelight, where samurai celebrated victories with delicate dishes served on lacquer trays, and where the quiet rustle of silk mingled with the clink of silverware. Fine dining, at its heart, is not just about eating. It is about theater, ritual, and the subtle power of presentation. It is a language without words, where the curve of a porcelain bowl, the aroma rising from a steaming dish, and the graceful movement of a server can speak of wealth, identity, and tradition. Yet behind the beauty lies a deeper story, centuries of cultural exchange, political ambition, and human ingenuity. Imagine walking into the grand dining hall of Versailles in the 17th century, gold gleaming on the walls, the air heavy with the scent of roasted game and sweet pastries, the murmurs of courtiers waiting for a glimpse of the king. Or picture a quiet Kyoto tea house, where each movement in the tea ceremony is measured, intentional, and layered with meaning, a performance of harmony, respect, and mindfulness. These are not just meals, they are acts of history. But here is the question that will guide our journey: how did fine dining become such a powerful stage for culture, politics, and even diplomacy? Why did rulers and nations invest so much in the way they served food, and what does it reveal about the world they lived in? As we explore, we'll uncover hidden truths, the rivalry between European courts to outshine each other in luxury, the centuries-old Japanese kaiseki tradition that elevated simplicity into high art, and the subtle ways colonial trade transformed the global palate. Support our work by liking, commenting, sharing, or joining. It all helps us keep bringing you these stories where English learning meets the rich flavors of history. And yet, just beyond the shimmer of silver and the scent of spices, there is a truth far more complex, one that changes the way we think about the very act of dining. For most of us today, eating is an everyday act, sometimes hurried, sometimes shared with friends, sometimes enjoyed alone. But in the grand chapters of history, the dining table was more than a place for nourishment. It was a stage for power, a mirror of social order, and at times, a weapon sharper than any sword. This is where our central question takes shape: was fine dining ever truly about the food itself, or was it always about something else entirely? Think of the royal banquets in 18th century France. They were not simply gatherings to enjoy exquisite cuisine. They were deliberate performances where every dish, every piece of cutlery, and every seat at the table was chosen to signal hierarchy and loyalty. The king's proximity, the order in which dishes arrived, the rare spices imported from across oceans, all of it spoke to wealth, authority, and influence. If you were invited to dine at the king's table, you were not just fed, you were reminded of your place in the grand theater of the state. Across the world, in Edo period Japan, the same principle took a different form. The kaiseki meal, refined, seasonal, balanced, was not a spectacle of excess, but a ceremony of precision. Every element, from the choice of seasonal flowers to the handmade ceramic bowl, expressed values of harmony and respect. It was fine dining as philosophy, where the beauty lay in restraint, not abundance. Yet, even here, the act of sharing such a meal could affirm alliances, display refinement, or settle political tensions. This leads us to a fascinating paradox. In cultures with vastly different approaches to fine dining, the meal still became a political and cultural statement. In Europe, grandeur and opulence spoke of strength. In Japan, subtlety and discipline conveyed depth and sophistication. Different languages, same message, influence was being served, course by course. So, was fine dining ever pure, a simple celebration of flavor and craftsmanship? Or has it always been tangled in the ambitions of those who could afford to control the menu? And if so, does that diminish its artistry, or make it all the more remarkable? Consider this: the moment a dish leaves the kitchen and arrives at the table, it is not only a taste to be enjoyed, but also a message to be interpreted. Who is it for? Why is it here? What story is it telling? And perhaps most importantly, who decided that this was the story to tell? As we search for answers, we'll travel through royal kitchens and hidden tea rooms, across spice routes and into the minds of chefs who served more than just meals. Because the truth behind fine dining might not lie in the recipe, but in the intentions of those who wrote it. Few realized it then, but the first great transformations in dining were already beginning, and they would forever change what it meant to eat at the world's most prestigious tables. To understand how fine dining traditions took shape, we must journey back to the courts, castles, and ceremonial halls where it all began, places where a meal was never just a meal. In medieval Europe, banquets were sprawling affairs, but they lacked the elegance we associate with fine dining today. Picture a great wooden hall lit by torches, where roasted meats were carved at the table and served on thick bread trenchers instead of plates. Guests ate with their hands, shared cups, and dined to the sound of minstrels and the smell of open fires. It was lavish, yes, but not refined. The purpose was to impress through abundance, whole roasted boars, endless pies, and barrels of wine, rather than artistry. This changed dramatically during the Renaissance. As wealth from trade and exploration poured into Europe, courts like those in Florence and Paris began to transform meals into spectacles of beauty and precision. Porcelain from China, spices from India, and cocoa from the New World turned kitchens into laboratories of experimentation. In France, Catherine de' Medici is often credited with introducing refined table manners and sophisticated Italian culinary techniques to the French court. Dining became an art form, with an increasing focus on presentation, order, and etiquette. By the 17th century, the court of Louis XIV at Versailles had perfected the theater of dining. The king's table, known as the grand couvert, was a public ritual. Nobles watched as Louis ate, each course arriving in precise sequence, accompanied by an orchestra of servants. Here, the architecture of the dining room, the choreography of service, and the symbolism of each ingredient worked together to reinforce the power of the monarch. A simple soup could be a statement of dominance if it contained rare truffles or spices only the king could afford. Meanwhile, across the world in Japan, an entirely different tradition was unfolding. The kaiseki meal emerged from the tea ceremony, which itself was rooted in Zen Buddhist principles. In the 16th century, tea masters like Sen no Rikyu refined the concept of wabi-sabi, beauty in simplicity and imperfection, and extended it to the dining experience. Kaiseki was the opposite of Versailles excess, a series of small, seasonal dishes served with meticulous care. A single bowl of clear broth with a delicate slice of seasonal fish could be as profound as a royal banquet, because it reflected nature, seasonality, and the host's sensitivity to the guest. Colonial trade connected these worlds in surprising ways. The Dutch East India Company, the British Empire, and other trading powers brought exotic goods to Europe: tea, coffee, chocolate, sugar, and spices, which transformed menus and dining habits. Likewise, Japanese porcelain found its way into European homes, influencing table settings and the visual language of fine dining. By the 19th century, fine dining began to step beyond royal courts into the public sphere. The rise of the restaurant culture in Paris, after the French Revolution, opened refined cuisine to wealthy citizens. chefs who had once cooked exclusively for aristocrats now opened establishments where anyone with money could taste dishes that once belonged to kings. This democratization of fine dining spread across Europe and eventually the world, shaping the culinary capitals we know today. In the 20th century, global travel and media accelerated the blending of traditions. French haute cuisine influenced luxury hotels in New York. Tokyo adopted Western multi-course meals for diplomatic functions, and chefs from different cultures began borrowing techniques from each other. The idea of fine dining was no longer bound to one style. It became a conversation between cultures, East and West, old and new, tradition and innovation. But if this history shows anything, it's that fine dining never evolved in isolation. It was shaped by politics, trade, philosophy, and social change. The table was always a meeting point of cultures, of ideas, of ambitions. And yet, for all the beauty and refinement, something else was at play, forces behind the curtain, unseen by most diners, that determined not only what was served, but why it was served at all. These hidden influences would shape the very meaning of the meal. Behind the glittering silverware and artfully arranged dishes, fine dining has always been about far more than taste. Every element, from the choice of menu to the seating arrangement, could be an instrument of strategy, persuasion, or subtle domination. In the royal courts of Europe, meals were carefully designed to display power. At Versailles, the grand couvert was as much a political performance as a dining experience. Only certain nobles were allowed to serve the king, a privilege that reinforced loyalty and hierarchy. The food itself, rare ingredients like pineapples from colonial greenhouses, sugar sculptures imported from Caribbean plantations, told a story about France's global reach and control over distant lands. The king's table was a map of empire, rendered in edible form. To eat there was to participate in the politics of display, whether one realized it or not. In Japan's Edo period, the motives were different but equally deliberate. The kaiseki tradition, with its emphasis on seasonality and harmony, was also a silent assertion of cultural refinement. For samurai leaders and wealthy merchants, hosting such meals signaled their understanding of omotenashi, the art of thoughtful hospitality, and their mastery of aesthetic codes. A guest invited to such a meal was being shown not just generosity, but also the host's place in the social order. Even the selection of tea utensils could communicate alliances, philosophical leanings, or loyalty to a particular school of thought. Trade networks amplified these messages. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the arrival of spices, coffee, and chocolate into Europe was not simply about flavor, it was about possession. Serving cinnamon-laced desserts or chocolate drinks was a way to demonstrate a nation's naval power, colonial success, and economic strength. The dining table became a miniature world stage where global politics played out in the most intimate of settings. But there were more subtle forces, too. Fine dining traditions were shaped by the ambitions of individual chefs, whose creations could elevate or embarrass a patron. In 19th-century France, chefs like Marie-Antoine Carême and Auguste Escoffier reinvented the culinary arts, creating elaborate multi-course meals that became symbols of cultural leadership. A wealthy host who hired a celebrated chef was making a public declaration, "I am a patron of the arts, a supporter of refinement, a leader in taste." Diplomacy often passed through the dining room before it reached the conference table. Treaties were softened over shared meals, tensions eased with a glass of rare vintage wine. In some cases, the meal was the diplomacy. A state banquet in Paris might include dishes named after the visiting dignitary's homeland, blending French technique with foreign ingredients to create a subtle flattery. In Japan, Presenting a dish that reflected a guest's birth season could convey deep respect, even without a word spoken. There was also the motive of cultural preservation, a quieter but equally powerful force. In times of political upheaval, maintaining traditional dining customs could be a way of holding onto identity. In Meiji-era Japan, when Western influences flooded the country, kaiseki practitioners doubled down on their traditions, preserving a form of dining that carried centuries of history. Similarly, in post-revolutionary France, the emergence of restaurants helped safeguard and spread the culinary techniques once reserved for aristocracy, ensuring that a national identity rooted in gastronomy would survive into the modern age. Yet, for all its refinement, fine dining has not been free from contradictions. The very symbols of sophistication, porcelain from China, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from Southeast Asia, were often products of exploitation, forced labor, and colonization. The beauty on the plate sometimes masked the suffering that made it possible. This raises uncomfortable questions. Can art be separated from the injustices that funded it? Can a meal truly be an act of harmony if it depends on inequality? Even in contemporary times, these forces remain. Michelin-starred restaurants craft not just menus but entire experiences meant to position themselves in a global hierarchy of taste. State dinners still rely on culinary symbolism to send messages without making statements. And cultural heritage menus are now part of a nation's soft power, drawing tourists and enhancing a country's image abroad. Fine dining, then, is a stage with many layers, the visible one of flavor and elegance, and the hidden one of motive and message. Every course is a chapter in a larger story about power, identity, and influence. But these stories are not told by institutions alone. They are also lived and felt by the people who sit at the table, guests, hosts, and those whose labor makes the meal possible. And in those moments, history becomes deeply human. If the grand dining rooms and ceremonial banquets tell one part of the story, the emotions and experiences of the people within them reveal another, more intimate, more fragile. Fine dining is not only the product of cultural forces, it is lived through human moments, both tender and tense. Consider the nervous young diplomat attending his first royal banquet in 18th-century France. Surrounded by the glitter of Versailles, he knows that every glance, every movement of his fork is being watched. A dropped spoon could be remembered for years. The golden plates, the rare fruits from distant colonies, they are dazzling, but they also carry the weight of expectation. He tastes each dish, not just for pleasure, but with the knowledge that his reactions are part of an unspoken negotiation. Or imagine the tea master in Kyoto, preparing a kaiseki meal for a high-ranking guest. He rises before dawn to gather the freshest bamboo shoots, to ensure the miso has aged to perfection, to arrange each flower in the alcove so that it speaks silently of the current season. His work is a meditation on respect, a quiet act of devotion. And yet, he is also aware that his guest's response will ripple through their circle of influence. A poorly balanced dish could be more than a disappointment, it could be a blemish on his reputation, perhaps even on the host's honor. In the kitchens, stories multiply. Servants and cooks worked long hours to create perfection on the plate, often invisible to the guests who enjoyed it. In the 19th-century Parisian restaurant scene, apprentices to legendary chefs endured harsh conditions, learning the discipline and artistry that might one day allow them to rise. Their hands carried burns from hot pans, their clothes were marked with the scent of butter and herbs. For them, each dish was both a test and a promise. Even among the guests, fine dining could evoke mixed emotions. There was joy, certainly, the delight of tasting something exquisite, the thrill of being part of a rarefied world. But there could also be discomfort. Some felt the weight of formality pressing down, afraid of breaking a rule they did not know. Others, from humbler backgrounds, felt the sharp edge of exclusion when they realized that such elegance was not meant for everyone. Then there were those who saw in fine dining an ideology, a vision of how the world should be. For the advocates of wabi-sabi in Japan, the meal was a lesson in humility, in finding beauty in the simple and imperfect. For the champions of French haute cuisine, it was a declaration that refinement and creativity could elevate life itself. And for political leaders, it was a tool, a way to express values, forge unity, or assert dominance without speaking a single word. But perhaps the most striking moments are those when the art of dining transcended politics or status. A visiting poet in Edo, Japan once wrote that in the quiet of a kaiseki meal, he felt the weight of centuries distilled into a single sip of broth. A French soldier returning from war recounted being invited to a village feast where the table was simple, but the welcome so warm that it outshone any royal banquet. These moments remind us that fine dining, at its best, is about connection, between host and guest, between tradition and the present, between human beings sharing the most universal of acts. And so we see that the legacy of fine dining is not only in the records of courts and the archives of recipes. It is in the heartbeat of those who created it, those who experienced it, and those who carried its memory forward. It is a human story, as full of tension, hope, pride, and vulnerability as any in history. It was in these human exchanges, both grand and humble, that the deeper meaning of fine dining was quietly written, and it is in these moments that we begin to see how the past still speaks to the present. Looking at the long arc of fine dining's history, it becomes clear that a meal is never just a meal. It is a reflection of values, a mirror of society, and at times, a silent blueprint for the future. What we learn from the courts of Versailles, the tea houses of Kyoto, and the gilded restaurants of Paris is not only about food, it is about the human instinct to turn even the act of eating into a statement. In today's world, the tradition of fine dining continues to carry layers of meaning. Michelin-starred restaurants still craft experiences that go beyond the plate, telling a story through lighting, service, and even the sequence of courses. State banquets still speak a diplomatic language of flavors. And yet, there is a shift, a growing awareness that dining can also be a platform for sustainability, cultural preservation, and inclusivity. From Canada's high-end restaurants sourcing local ingredients from indigenous farmers, to Japan's renewed focus on seasonal menus that honor nature's rhythm, to New Zealand's chefs blending Maori culinary traditions with modern techniques, fine dining is once again being redefined. The best tables are now asking not only how the food is served, but why it is served that way. There is also a lesson here about power. In the past, the privilege of fine dining was a symbol of status, often inaccessible to most. Today, some chefs are deliberately breaking that tradition, offering exquisite meals in smaller, more intimate settings, or creating tasting menus at a fraction of the traditional cost. In doing so, they challenge the old notion that refinement belongs only to the elite. But perhaps the most valuable insight is about connection. Throughout history, the dining table has been a place where differences could be bridged or deepened. The intention of the host, the openness of the guest, and the shared respect for the meal all determined the outcome. This remains true today. Whether we sit at a street stall or under crystal chandeliers, the way we eat together reflects the way we live together. So we might ask ourselves, what kind of story are we telling when we share a meal? Are we honoring traditions while making room for new voices? Are we mindful of where our ingredients come from, and of the human hands that prepared them? Are we using the table to close distances between people, or to keep them apart. The story of fine dining reminds us that beauty, taste, and artistry can exist alongside responsibility, humility, and inclusion. It invites us to imagine a world where the elegance of a meal is not only in its presentation, but in its respect for culture, people, and the planet. Few realized it in the candlelit halls of history, but every dish, from the simplest soup to the most elaborate banquet, was shaping a future that we still have the power to influence. Fine dining, for all its elegance and artistry, carries with it an air of mystery, one that history has never fully resolved. Was it simply the natural evolution of humanity's love for food, or was it deliberately crafted as a stage for power, diplomacy, and social hierarchy? Even today, historians debate whether the earliest banquets in ancient courts were about the dishes themselves or the unspoken political messages simmering beneath the surface. Some traditions have clear origins, the precision of Japanese kaiseki tied to Zen aesthetics, or the French service à la Russe influenced by Russian aristocracy, yet others remain elusive. Who first decided that a dining experience should unfold like an opera, with courses arriving in carefully choreographed succession? And why do certain rules, like the placement of silverware or the ritual of pairing wine, persist across centuries even as empires rise and fall? Culturally, the echoes of fine dining ripple far beyond the table. It has shaped language, art, and even architecture. The design of grand hotels, the structure of royal banquets, and the rhythm of formal diplomatic dinners all carry DNA from centuries-old culinary codes. Chefs today may be innovators, but they still inherit an invisible script, one that dictates how taste, timing, and presentation weave together to create an experience. In our modern era, fine dining continues to be both a bridge and a barrier. On one hand, it fosters cross-cultural appreciation, blending flavors from far-flung corners of the globe. On the other, it raises questions about exclusivity, privilege, and authenticity. Is fine dining a universal cultural treasure, or does its history of elitism still linger in the shadows? And then there are the mysteries that no cookbook can answer. Why do certain flavors seem to resonate across cultures? How did ancient civilizations, without modern tools, master techniques that even today's chefs find challenging? Could there be lost culinary traditions, entire taste profiles, that history quietly swallowed? Perhaps part of fine dining's magic is that it resists complete understanding. It is at once ancient and modern, intimate and political, ephemeral and enduring. In every perfectly plated dish lies a story, some written in the records of kings and empresses, others whispered only in the steam rising from the plate. We may never uncover all its secrets, but maybe that's the point. Mystery is, after all, its most exquisite spice. Long after the plates have been cleared, after the wine has lost its chill and the candle has burned low, something remains, not just the taste, but the story. Every fine dining tradition, from the meticulous folding of Japanese kaiseki menus to the slow, deliberate pouring of French sauces, carries with it centuries of human hands, minds, and hearts. It is tempting to see such traditions as luxuries for the few, but in truth, they are silent archives of culture, edible libraries, where recipes are chapters, and flavors are sentences written in the language of the senses. Each bite is an inheritance, passed down across kitchens, borders, and generations. And now, the question lingers, in our age of speed, convenience, and endless digital distraction, will we still find the patience to sit, savor, and listen to what our food is telling us? Or will we let centuries-old conversations between farmers, chefs, and diners fade into background noise? Perhaps the next time you taste something extraordinary, you might pause, just for a heartbeat, and wonder whose hands shaped it, whose laughter once filled the kitchen where it was born, and whose stories you might pass on in return. Because fine dining is not just about eating well, it is about remembering well. If this journey into the hidden artistry of fine dining has stirred your curiosity, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which culinary tradition do you think deserves more attention, and why? Share your ideas in the comments, give this video a like if it brought you something new, and pass it along to someone who believes food can be more than fuel. After all, history doesn't only live in books. Sometimes, it lives on a plate, waiting for you to take the first bite.